By sunrise, the once powerful sheriff was on his knees, screaming in agony. His manhood was rotting away. But how did a respected lawman end up here? And what role did a 72-year-old woman play in this chilling story? What began as a secret night of passion would unravel into one of the most bizarre crime stories in American history. The man who once commanded respect from an entire county, who wore his badge like armor against the world's evils, was now reduced to a writhing mass of flesh and desperation. His screams echoed through the emergency room corridors as doctors struggled to comprehend what they were witnessing. This wasn't just any illness. This wasn't some random accident. This was something far more disturbing, something that would shake the very foundations of justice in Millbrook County, Tennessee. Before we continue deeper into this shocking tale, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Who was this mysterious woman who allegedly held such power over a man sworn to uphold the law? Why did Sheriff Jackson Mitchell risk everything, his reputation, his family, his entire career for one night with someone old enough to be his grandmother? And how did it all end with his body decaying from within, piece by agonizing piece? Was this an accident born from forbidden passion? Was it calculated revenge from a woman wronged? Or was it something darker, something that defied explanation and challenged everything this small town believed about the natural world? The truth would shock not only his family, not only his deputies, but the entire town he swore to protect. And as we'll discover, this wasn't Martha Blackwood's first encounter with mysterious illnesses that befell the men who crossed her path. Sheriff Jackson Mitchell was everything Millbrook County thought they wanted in a lawman. At 45, he stood 6 feet 2 inches tall, with broad shoulders that filled out his uniform perfectly, and steel-gray eyes that could make even the toughest criminals think twice about their choices. He'd served the county for 18 years, climbing from deputy to sheriff through a combination of political savvy and genuine police work. The people of Millbrook trusted him implicitly. When Jackson Mitchell gave his word, you could take it to the bank. When he looked you in the eye and told you everything would be all right, you believed him. He had that rare quality that made people feel safe just by being in his presence. But like so many men in positions of power, Jackson Mitchell had secrets. Secrets that festered beneath his polished exterior like infection beneath a bandage. His marriage to Rebecca had been crumbling for years, though they maintained the facade for the sake of appearances. In a county where family values were everything, a divorced sheriff was political suicide, so they played their parts at church on Sundays, at community barbecues, at high school football games, but behind closed doors, they lived like strangers sharing a house. Rebecca suspected Jackson of having affairs, though she could never prove it. She'd catch him coming home at odd hours, catch him washing his clothes himself when he'd never done laundry in 20 years of marriage, catch him taking phone calls that made him step outside and speak in hushed tones. The truth was, Jackson Mitchell had been unfaithful more times than he could count. Power, it seemed, was the ultimate aphrodisiac in Millbrook County. Then there was Martha Blackwood, 72 years old, living alone in a farmhouse that her grandfather had built with his own hands in 1889. To most folks in Millbrook, Martha was just another elderly woman tending to her garden, keeping to herself, occasionally selling homemade preserves at the farmer's market. But Martha Blackwood was far more complex than her neighbors realized. She'd grown up learning the old ways from her grandmother, learning about herbs and roots and tinctures that could heal or harm depending on the dosage and the intent behind them. Some people whispered about her late at night when they thought nobody was listening. They called her a witch, though none would dare say it to her face. They spoke of remedies that worked too well, of illnesses that struck her enemies with suspicious timing, of men who'd crossed her and later found themselves inexplicably bedridden for weeks. Martha had never married, though it wasn't for lack of suitors. In her younger days, she'd been what folks called a handsome woman, with raven black hair and eyes the color of deep water. But she'd always been different. always been apart from the conventional expectations of women in rural Tennessee. She'd studied plants and their properties with the intensity of a scientist, though she'd never set foot in a university. Her farmhouse was filled with jars of dried herbs, books on botany and chemistry, and notebooks filled with her spidery handwriting documenting decades of experimentation. The townspeople who bought her preserves and remedies never questioned where she'd learned what she knew. They were just grateful that Martha's tinctures could cure a child's croup faster than any doctor's prescription, that her salves could heal wounds that refused to close, that her teas could ease pain that had plagued someone for years. But there were darker rumors, too. Whispers about men who'd tried to take advantage of Martha's isolated living situation and later found themselves struck by mysterious ailments. Stories about a land developer who'd tried to pressure her into selling her property and ended up in the hospital with symptoms no doctor could explain. Tales of a banker who'd attempted to foreclose on her mortgage during the hard times of the 1980s and subsequently suffered what appeared to be a nervous breakdown, babbling about nightmares and visions that drove him to early retirement. These stories were dismissed by most as coincidence or superstition, but they created an aura around Martha Blackwood that kept most people at a respectful distance. Their worlds should never have collided. Jackson Mitchell, with his badge and his power and his carefully constructed public image, should never have found himself in the orbit of Martha Blackwood with her herbs and her secrets and her reputation for dealing with men who crossed her. But fate has a way of bringing together the most unlikely people at the most impossible moments. And on that warm September night in 2023, when the crickets were singing their last songs of summer and the air was heavy with the promise of autumn, these two very different souls would meet in a way that would destroy one of them completely and forever change the other. September 15th, 2023. A Thursday night that would live in Millbrook County's collective memory for years to come. Jackson Mitchell had been investigating reports of illegal moonshining operations in the remote hills surrounding Martha's property. It wasn't unusual for him to work late, to follow leads that took him to the far corners of his jurisdiction. What was unusual was what happened when he knocked on Martha Blackwood's door at 11:47 p.m., ostensibly to ask if she'd seen anything suspicious in the area. Martha answered the door wearing a simple cotton dress, her silver hair loose around her shoulders. She invited him in for coffee, she said, because it was late, and he looked tired and a lawman's work was never done. Jackson should have declined. He should have asked his questions and left. He should have remembered that he was a married man with a reputation to protect. But something about Martha Blackwood drew him in like a moth to flame. The interior of Martha's farmhouse was unlike anything Jackson had ever seen. Candles flickered throughout the rooms, casting dancing shadows on walls lined with shelves of glass jars, filled with herbs and powders and liquids in every color imaginable. The air was thick with the scent of lavender and something else, something earthy and primal that he couldn't identify. Martha moved through this space like a queen in her castle, lighting more candles, preparing what she called her special coffee blend. Jackson found himself mesmerized by the way the candlelight played across her face, the way her movements seemed almost choreographed, the way her voice seemed to wrap around him like silk. He'd come here as Sheriff Jackson Mitchell, but somehow, in this flickering candlelight, he felt like just another man susceptible to desires he couldn't name. The coffee Martha served him was unlike anything he'd ever tasted. Rich and dark, with an underlying sweetness that seemed to warm him from the inside out. She told him it was her grandmother's recipe, a blend of coffee beans and herbs that had been passed down through generations of Blackwood women. As Jackson drank, Martha talked about her life, her solitude, her connection to the land that surrounded them. She spoke about loneliness and how it could drive people to make choices they never imagined they'd make. She spoke about power, and how it could corrupt even the best of men, how it could make them believe they were above the rules that governed ordinary mortals. Jackson found himself nodding along, feeling more relaxed than he had in years, feeling understood in a way that his wife had never understood him. What happened next would become the subject of intense speculation and investigation. Jackson would later claim, during his brief moments of coherent testimony, that Martha had seduced him. that she had used her feminine wiles and his moment of weakness to lure him into her bedroom, that what followed was consensual, though ill-advised. Martha's version of events, delivered with infuriating calm during police interrogations, was quite different. She claimed that Jackson had become aggressive, that he had misinterpreted her hospitality as something more intimate, that he had forced himself on her despite her protests. She claimed that what she gave him that night wasn't seduction, but self-defense, that the special ingredients in her coffee, the candles burning throughout her house, the atmosphere that seemed so romantic to Jackson's fevered imagination, were actually protective measures she'd learned to take whenever men visited her property after dark. The physical evidence of what transpired in Martha's bedroom was limited and contradictory. There were signs of intimate activity, but whether consensual or forced remained unclear. What was clear was that sometime during that night, Martha Blackwood administered something to Sheriff Jackson Mitchell that would change his life forever. She would later describe it as a tincture made from specific roots and herbs, something that would cause temporary impotence and serve as a lesson in humility for a man who had clearly forgotten his place. Jackson would describe it as poison, as an attempt on his life by a woman who practiced dark arts that had no place in the modern world. The truth, as is often the case in stories like this, probably lay somewhere in between. By dawn, Jackson Mitchell was experiencing symptoms that no doctor in Millbrook County had ever encountered. His intimate areas were swollen and discolored, with what appeared to be rapid tissue decomposition. He was running a fever that spiked to dangerous levels, and he was experiencing hallucinations that made him scream about spiders crawling under his skin and snakes coiled around his organs. Martha found him collapsed in her hallway as she was preparing her morning tea. She called 911, she would later testify, because regardless of what had transpired between them, she wasn't a killer. She was a healer who had perhaps miscalculated the dosage of what was meant to be a teaching moment. But as the ambulance sirens wailed across the rural landscape of Millbrook County, carrying Jackson Mitchell toward a fate that would destroy everything he'd ever built, Martha Blackwood stood in her doorway watching them go with an expression that observers would later describe as satisfied. "If you're still here with me, drop 'I'm still watching." In the comments, let's see who's brave enough to keep going, because what we've heard so far is only the beginning of this twisted tale. The real horror was just beginning to unfold. Millbrook County General Hospital had seen its share of medical mysteries over the years: farming accidents, hunting mishaps, the occasional overdose or poisoning from homemade alcohol. But nothing had prepared Dr. Sarah Chen for what arrived in her emergency room at 7:23 a.m. on September 16, 2023. Sheriff Jackson Mitchell was barely conscious, his body racked with convulsions, his skin flushed with fever, and his genital area showing signs of what appeared to be rapid necrosis. Dr. Chen had completed her residency at Johns Hopkins and had seen everything from flesh-eating bacteria to exotic tropical diseases during her fellowship in emergency medicine. But this was different. This was something that defied her medical training and challenged everything she thought she knew about human physiology. The first priority was stabilizing Jackson's condition and determining what had caused such rapid and devastating symptoms. Blood tests revealed the presence of several unknown compounds, organic molecules that the hospital's laboratory couldn't identify. Dr. Chen immediately suspected poisoning, but the toxicology patterns didn't match any known substance in their database. She consulted with specialists at Vanderbilt University Medical Center and the Centers for Disease Control, sending samples and photos that left even the most experienced toxicologists scratching their heads. Meanwhile, Jackson's condition continued to deteriorate. The necrosis was spreading, requiring increasingly aggressive surgical interventions to prevent systemic infection. His fever remained dangerously high despite every treatment Dr. Chen attempted, and his periods of consciousness were marked by incoherent rambling about witches and curses and supernatural forces. Word of the sheriff's mysterious illness spread through Millbrook County like wildfire. In a community where everyone knew everyone else's business, it was impossible to keep something this dramatic quiet. The official story, released by the sheriff's department, was that Jackson had suffered a severe allergic reaction while investigating a case and was receiving treatment. But the truth has a way of leaking out in small towns, and soon there were whispers about where Jackson had been found, about Martha Blackwood's involvement, about the strange circumstances surrounding his condition. Some people speculated about food poisoning or contaminated water. Others wondered if Jackson had been exposed to some kind of chemical during his law enforcement work. But a growing number of voices whispered about more supernatural explanations. Deputy Marcus Webb, Jackson's second-in-command, found himself in the impossible position of investigating his own boss while trying to maintain order in a county that was rapidly descending into hysteria. Webb was a good cop, methodical and thorough, but he'd never handled anything approaching this level of complexity. He interviewed Martha Blackwood 3 times during the first week of Jackson's hospitalization, and each session left him more confused than before. Martha was completely calm, answering his questions with a directness that was almost unsettling. Yes, Sheriff Mitchell had visited her property. Yes, they had consumed coffee together. Yes, she had provided him with what she described as a medicinal tincture. No, she had not intended to harm him. No, she did not consider herself responsible for his condition. Her explanations were consistent but incomplete, filled with references to herbal remedies and traditional healing practices that meant nothing to Deputy Webb's law enforcement background. The investigation became more complicated when Webb discovered that Jackson's visit to Martha's property had not been officially logged or documented. There was no record of him investigating moonshining operations in that area, no reports filed, no evidence that his presence at Martha's farmhouse had been anything other than personal. This discovery forced Webb to confront the possibility that his respected boss had been engaged in some kind of inappropriate relationship with a woman old enough to be his grandmother. The thought was so disturbing, so contrary to everything Webb believed about Jackson Mitchell, that he initially dismissed it. But as the evidence mounted, as Martha's calm admissions painted a picture of intimate contact between them, Webb was forced to accept that his mentor and role model had feet of clay. The media attention began slowly, but built quickly, as word of the story spread beyond Millbrook County's borders. Local news stations picked up the story first, attracted by the bizarre circumstances and the involvement of a public figure. Within days, regional newspapers were running headlines about the Witch of Millbrook County and the sheriff's mysterious illness. Social media exploded with theories and speculation, turning Martha Blackwood into an internet sensation and Jackson Mitchell into a cautionary tale. The story had everything that modern audiences craved: sex, power, mystery, and the supernatural. Television producers began calling the sheriff's department, offering money for exclusive interviews. True crime podcasters descended on Millbrook County like vultures, interviewing anyone willing to talk and spinning elaborate theories about what had really happened in Martha's farmhouse. Rebecca Mitchell found herself in the impossible position of standing by her husband publicly while privately grappling with the revelation of his infidelity. She visited Jackson in the hospital daily, holding his hand during his brief moments of consciousness, speaking to reporters about their strong marriage and their faith that he would recover. But behind closed doors, she was consumed with rage and humiliation. 23 years of marriage, and it had come to this. Her husband reduced to a babbling invalid because he couldn't keep his pants zipped around a woman older than his own mother. The sympathy from their community felt like salt in her wounds. Every kind word and casserole delivery a reminder that everyone now knew her husband had betrayed her in the most degrading way imaginable. The investigation took another disturbing turn when Deputy Webb discovered that Martha Blackwood had been involved in similar situations before. Historical records revealed a pattern of men falling mysteriously ill after having conflicts or inappropriate contact with Martha, a land developer in 1998 who had tried to pressure her into selling her property and later suffered what doctors called a nervous breakdown. A meter reader in 2003 who had allegedly made inappropriate advances and subsequently developed a skin condition that left him permanently scarred. A county commissioner in 2010 who had opposed her request for agricultural exemptions and later experienced what appeared to be systematic organ failure that doctors couldn't explain. The pattern was subtle enough that no one had connected the dots before, but when viewed together, these incidents painted a disturbing picture of a woman who had been dealing with problematic men in her own unique way for decades. Each of these cases had been dismissed at the time as coincidence or stress-related illness. The men involved had been reluctant to discuss the details of their interactions with Martha, and medical professionals had been unable to find any definitive cause for their conditions. But Webb began to realize that Martha Blackwood had been hiding in plain sight for years, using her reputation as a harmless old woman and her knowledge of herbal medicine to settle scores with men who crossed her. The question was whether what happened to Jackson Mitchell was a continuation of this pattern or something more serious, something that crossed the line from unofficial justice into attempted murder. 3 weeks into Jackson Mitchell's hospitalization, Dr. Sarah Chen made a discovery that would change everything. Working with forensic toxicologists from the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, she had finally identified the mysterious compounds in Jackson's blood. The primary agent was a derivative of ricin, the deadly poison found in castor beans, but it had been chemically modified in ways that suggested sophisticated knowledge of biochemistry. Mixed with this were traces of several other plant-based toxins, each carefully chosen to create specific physiological effects. This wasn't some folk remedy gone wrong. This was a deliberately crafted poison designed to cause maximum suffering while avoiding immediate death. The revelation that Martha Blackwood possessed not just traditional herbal knowledge, but advanced understanding of biochemistry forced investigators to completely reevaluate everything they thought they knew about her. A search warrant for her property revealed a hidden laboratory in her basement, equipped with scientific instruments that would be impressive in a university research facility. Martha had been conducting sophisticated chemical experiments for decades, developing new ways to extract and concentrate the active ingredients in various plants. Her notebooks, written in a code that took investigators weeks to decipher, contained detailed records of her experiments on unwitting subjects over the past 30 years. The scope of Martha's activities was staggering. She had been systematically testing her concoctions on men who she felt had wronged her, carefully documenting their symptoms and refining her formulas based on the results. What the community had dismissed as coincidental illnesses were actually the results of a decades-long research project into the effects of plant-based toxins on the human body. Jackson Mitchell hadn't been the victim of a crime of passion or a teaching moment gone wrong. He had been the latest test subject in Martha Blackwood's twisted scientific experiments. The investigation revealed that Martha had obtained her advanced knowledge through correspondence with scientists around the world, trading information about traditional plant remedies for technical knowledge about biochemistry and toxicology. She had built a network of contacts in the academic community who knew her as a respected researcher into ethnobotany, not realizing that she was applying their shared knowledge to harm real people. Martha's farmhouse contained thousands of letters and emails documenting her collaborations with researchers in universities across the globe, creating a paper trail that stretched back more than 2 decades. But the most shocking discovery came when investigators found Martha's detailed psychological profiles of her victims. She had been studying them for months or even years before striking, learning their habits, their weaknesses, their medical histories. Her attack on Jackson Mitchell had been planned with military precision, taking advantage of his reputation for extramarital affairs and his predictable response to what she knew he would perceive as seduction. Martha had chosen her moment carefully, waited for a night when she knew Jackson would be alone and vulnerable, and then executed a plan that had been months in the making. The medical examination that followed these discoveries revealed that Jackson's condition was even more dire than originally thought. Martha's poison was designed to cause progressive organ failure, with the genital necrosis being just the first stage of a process that would eventually shut down his liver, kidneys, and nervous system. Dr. Chen realized that Jackson was dying slowly and painfully, just as Martha had intended. The poison was a masterpiece of malicious chemistry, calibrated to cause maximum suffering over an extended period while making it difficult for doctors to identify and treat. Emergency treatment began immediately, but the damage was extensive. Jackson's body had been systematically breaking down for weeks, and reversing the process required experimental treatments that carried their own risks. Dr. Chen worked with specialists from around the country to develop a treatment protocol, essentially using Jackson Mitchell as a test case for antidotes to a poison that had never been documented before. The sheriff, who had once commanded respect and authority throughout Millbrook County, became a medical guinea pig in a desperate attempt to save his life. The revelation that Martha Blackwood was not just an eccentric old woman, but a sophisticated poisoner sent shockwaves through the community. People began reevaluating every interaction they'd ever had with her, every remedy she'd provided, every time they'd seen her at the farmer's market or the general store. The preserves and tinctures that people had been buying from Martha for years were suddenly viewed with suspicion and terror. The county health department launched a massive recall effort, trying to track down and test every product Martha had sold over the past decade. As news of Martha's true nature spread, the story attracted national attention. This wasn't just a case of small-town scandal anymore. This was a story about a female serial killer who had been operating in plain sight for decades, using traditional medicine as a cover for sophisticated criminal activity. Martha Blackwood became the subject of true crime documentaries and academic studies, a case study in how societal assumptions about gender and age could allow a dangerous individual to operate undetected for years. The arrest warrant for Martha Blackwood charged her with attempted murder in the first degree, along with multiple counts of assault and reckless endangerment related to her previous victims. When Deputy Webb arrived at her farmhouse to make the arrest, he found Martha sitting calmly on her front porch, as if she had been expecting him. She offered no resistance, made no attempt to flee or destroy evidence. She simply stood up, allowed Webb to place the handcuffs on her wrists, and asked if she could bring her reading glasses to jail because she didn't like to be without a book. The trial of Martha Blackwood began 6 months later, attracting media attention from around the world. Legal experts called it one of the most unusual criminal cases in American history, involving a defendant who had used scientific knowledge to commit crimes that blurred the line between traditional poisoning and biological warfare. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Michael Harrison, painted Martha as a calculating serial killer who had preyed on men for decades, using her appearance as a harmless elderly woman to avoid suspicion. The defense, led by renowned criminal attorney Elizabeth Stone, argued that Martha was a victim herself, a woman who had been forced to defend herself against a lifetime of male aggression and sexual assault. The testimony during the trial revealed details about Martha's past that the community had never known. She had been sexually assaulted as a teenager by a neighbor who was never prosecuted. She had been cheated out of her inheritance by male relatives who assumed she was too simple to understand legal documents. She had been passed over for educational and professional opportunities because of her gender, despite possessing intelligence that surpassed most of her male contemporaries. The defense argued that Martha's actions, while illegal, were the result of a society that had failed to protect her and had left her no other means of seeking justice. The prosecution countered that regardless of Martha's past trauma, her actions constituted cold-blooded attempted murder. They presented evidence of her sophisticated planning, her detailed records of previous victims, and her complete lack of remorse for the suffering she had caused. Jackson Mitchell, who had survived his ordeal but remained permanently disabled, testified about the pain and humiliation he had endured. His testimony was difficult to listen to, as he described the ongoing medical complications that would plague him for the rest of his life, the destruction of his marriage and career, and the psychological trauma of knowing that someone had deliberately set out to destroy him. But Martha's own testimony was the most compelling part of the trial. Taking the stand in her own defense, she spoke for 3 days about her life, her research, and her motivations. She was articulate and intelligent, displaying a depth of knowledge about chemistry and botany that impressed even the prosecution's expert witnesses. She didn't deny what she had done to Jackson Mitchell and the other men, but she framed it as a form of justice that the legal system had failed to provide. She spoke about the arrogance of men who believed they could take what they wanted from women without consequences, about the protection that power and position gave to predators, about the necessity of creating her own system of accountability when the official system failed. Martha's testimony revealed that her attack on Jackson Mitchell had been motivated by more than just his unwanted advances that night. She had been aware of his reputation for extramarital affairs and his abuse of his position to pressure women into sexual relationships. She had heard stories from women in the county who had been too afraid or embarrassed to report Jackson's behavior through official channels. In Martha's twisted logic, Jackson represented everything that was wrong with male privilege and authority, and his punishment was meant to serve as a warning to other men who believed themselves untouchable. The jury deliberated for 5 days before reaching their verdict. They found Martha Blackwood guilty of attempted murder in the first degree, along with multiple counts of aggravated assault and reckless endangerment. The evidence of her premeditation and the sophisticated nature of her crimes made it impossible to accept the defense's argument that she was simply defending herself. However, the judge took Martha's age and her history of trauma into account during sentencing, giving her life in prison without the possibility of parole rather than the death penalty that the prosecution had requested. But the story didn't end with Martha's conviction. The investigation into her activities had opened a Pandora's box of questions about how many other victims there might have been over the decades. Law enforcement agencies across Tennessee and neighboring states began reviewing cold cases involving unexplained illnesses and deaths, looking for patterns that might connect to Martha's activities. Several additional cases were identified, including 2 deaths that were reclassified as homicides based on evidence found in Martha's laboratory. The revelation that Martha had been corresponding with researchers around the world raised questions about whether she had shared her knowledge with others. The FBI launched an investigation into her network of contacts, trying to determine if there were other individuals who might be using similar methods to harm people. The case sparked new research into the potential for plant-based weapons and led to changes in how law enforcement agencies investigate cases involving unusual toxins. Jackson Mitchell never fully recovered from his ordeal. The damage to his body was permanent, requiring ongoing medical treatment and multiple surgeries. His marriage to Rebecca ended in divorce, and his law enforcement career was over. He struggled with depression and post-traumatic stress, haunted by nightmares about his experience and the knowledge that Martha had selected him specifically for punishment. He eventually moved away from Millbrook County, seeking anonymity in a larger city where his story wasn't common knowledge. Martha Blackwood was transferred to a maximum security prison in Nashville, where she became something of a celebrity among other inmates and true crime enthusiasts. She received hundreds of letters from people around the world, some condemning her actions and others praising her for what they saw as striking a blow against patriarchal oppression. Martha answered many of these letters, engaging in philosophical discussions about justice, gender, and the role of violence in social change. She continued her research in prison, working on a book about her life and her theories about the use of traditional plant knowledge in modern contexts. The farmhouse where Martha had lived for decades was eventually demolished after being declared a hazardous site by environmental authorities. The contamination from her laboratory made it unsafe for habitation, and the county decided it was cheaper to tear it down than to attempt remediation. But the legacy of what happened there continued to haunt Millbrook County. Property values in the area plummeted, and several families moved away rather than live with the constant reminder of Martha's activities. The farmers' market where Martha had sold her preserves and tinctures never fully recovered, as people remained suspicious of any homemade products offered by local vendors. The case of Martha Blackwood and Sheriff Jackson Mitchell raises profound questions about justice, revenge, and the lengths to which people will go when they feel the system has failed them. Was Martha a brilliant woman driven to extremes by a lifetime of male oppression and sexual violence? Or was she simply a psychopath who used her gender and age as camouflage while she systematically tortured and killed? The jury reached their verdict, but the court of public opinion remains divided. Some see Martha as a monster who deserves to spend the rest of her life behind bars. Others view her as a tragic figure who was pushed to desperate measures by a society that refused to protect her. What do you think really happened that night in Martha's farmhouse? Was it a planned attack by a sophisticated killer, or did a defensive situation escalate beyond Martha's intentions? How do you feel about Jackson Mitchell? Was he an innocent victim of a madwoman's revenge, or did his history of abusing his power make him a legitimate target for Martha's unique brand of justice? And what about the other men who fell ill after encounters with Martha over the years? Were they all truly guilty of wronging her, or were some of them simply unlucky enough to cross paths with someone who had lost her grip on the difference between justice and revenge? Put yourself in the shoes of the people in this story. If you were Rebecca Mitchell, how would you cope with discovering that your husband's infidelity had led to such a bizarre and public humiliation? If you were Deputy Webb, how would you handle investigating your mentor and discovering that everything you believed about him was wrong? If you were Dr. Chen, how would you feel about treating someone who had been deliberately poisoned by another human being? And if you were a resident of Millbrook County, how would you react to learning that someone you'd known for years was capable of such calculated cruelty? These questions don't have easy answers, and perhaps that's what makes this case so compelling and disturbing. The story of Martha Blackwood and Jackson Mitchell is ultimately about the destructive power of secrets and the dangerous consequences of unchecked authority. It's about what happens when someone decides to take justice into their own hands and the collateral damage that results when personal vengeance replaces the rule of law. It's also about the assumptions we make about people based on their appearance, their age, and their gender, and how those assumptions can blind us to the potential for evil that exists in the most unlikely places. Martha Blackwood looked like someone's grandmother, but she possessed the knowledge and the will to destroy lives with scientific precision. Jackson Mitchell looked like the embodiment of law and order, but he used his position to prey on the women he was sworn to protect. Let us know in the comments what you think about this incredible true story. Do you believe Martha Blackwood got the justice she deserved, or should her sentence have been different? Do you think there are other Martha Blackwoods out there using their knowledge of chemistry and botany to settle scores with people who have wronged them? And how do you think communities can protect themselves from individuals who are willing to use science as a weapon against their neighbors? Your thoughts and opinions matter to us, and we read every comment you leave. If you found this story as fascinating and disturbing as we did, please share it with your friends and family. Stories like this need to be told, not just for their entertainment value, but as warnings about the potential for evil that can lurk beneath the most innocent facades. And if you thought this case was shocking, wait until you hear our next story about a respected family doctor who used his medical knowledge to systematically poison his patients over a period of 15 years, all while maintaining his reputation as one of the most trusted physicians in his community. That's a story that will make you question everything you think you know about the people you trust with your life. Until next time, stay safe, stay vigilant, and remember that the most dangerous predators are often the ones you never see coming.